So in this final session, we're going to be looking at some of the research techniques that can be used in regulatory decision making. Rob Sheldon is Managing Director of ESAN, which is one of the world-leading companies on willingness to pay, which has been used in many sectors. It has its critics, and there are alternatives, but it is a very important role, especially in price reviews. So please would you welcome Rob Sheldon on willingness to pay.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk to you about a specific way of undertaking customer engagement, as Roger has said. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways in which you can talk to customers qualitatively and quantitatively, but I'm going to be talking about willingness to pay or stated preference as an approach to try to determine things like investment benefits. And as Roger says, it is very commonly used, and it has got its critics, as he said. And in fact, I've borrowed from the paper that associated with today to list out some of the issues, and I've put the issue, what I call stated preference, as an approach. You may also know it as conjoint analysis, trade-off analysis, and so on. But I've put that alongside revealed preference, which effectively it set out to complement about 40 years ago. And really, Ofwat have recently, I think, re-injected and reignited the debate about where those two approaches kind of lie. So I've put the juxtaposition of them so we could look at some of the pros and cons of that. Now, as I say, this is a conversation that has been going over the last 40 years. Revealed preference approaches, when I started working, were the thing to do. You watched real-life experiments. People put fares up and they watched what happened when they did that, and they came to a conclusion as to what was driving, you know, what changes you could expect if you made those changes in the marketplace. If you built a new road, what happened, who used it, and so on. The problem with that was that there was a lot of noise in the data. You couldn't necessarily determine who was doing what. You knew that people as a whole were doing a certain thing, but who was that in particular? And it was very retrospective. So if you built a new piece of kit like an HS2, there's not really much that you can look at as the history. You might go to France and look at what happened when they built a new network, but in the auspices of UK, it would be difficult to do that. So that's why stated preference was born. And I think I'd just like to also make the point, and really sort of borrowing from Anna Bradley earlier today when she said that let's not compare the levels of independence. In this respect, let's not necessarily compare what is right or what is better about either of these approaches. They are complementary. And that debate has really been opened up, I think, by Ofwat with its term of triangulation, where they are trying to encourage us all to think in terms of undertaking different sorts of approaches. So let's then look at stated preference. Some of the difficulties that were highlighted, again, the water industry is really quite a leading edge environment for a lot of this work, and a lot of issues have come to the fore. Dealing with risk, one of the things that you need to do in some senses when you're exploring some of these issues in terms of security of supply and so on and so forth, is that there are risks associated with that. People don't understand risk. I once heard an expression which I think is probably true, that only 10% of the population understand what 10% means. And I think, whether it's 12% or 15% doesn't really matter. But I think it highlights the kind of issue. And in fact, under PR14, which was when a lot of these approaches were used, and a lot in health and a lot in lots of other areas, risk is just thrown out to people. And they're supposed to understand what 1 in 20,000 means, or 1 in 100,000. So there's a lot of complexity. And really, effectively, what you want to try to do is to make that side look more like that side and make it as real as possible. But let's just take stock of where we are at the moment. If we look at the journey that's taken place over the last 35 to 40 years, it's been driven particularly in the transport sector, where when I started work, 100% of the work was undertaken with techniques on this side. Now, it's about 90% on the right-hand side and 10% on the left. And the reason being that there aren't that many real-life experiments that you can deal with. But at the end of the day, trying to tie those two things up to approaches in triangulated approaches, methodologies, is the desirable outcome. And that, as I say, is what Ofwat have driven. But let's look, I'm now going to just focus on stated preference and not the revealed preference side of things. Let's look at some of the lessons that we've learnt over probably just the last 2 or 3 years. One, we should replicate real-world situations and transactions wherever possible. In fact, actually, that was a lesson that I realised back in the 70s when undertaking a very early stated preference study where we rewrote the British Rail timetables so that our customers could look at those timetables. It used to be a big book that everybody used to look at, and we rewrote it with Tipex and ink so that people could look at what had happened to their trains and so on. So it was a real-life transaction. In a minute, I'll show you the modern-day manifestation of that. We should focus on market differences and segmentation, and this is one of the ways in which this kind of approach is much easier to deal with. There's been talk earlier about behavioural economics. We try to build that in to what we do with these kind of experiments by building in behavioural economics biases and so on, and frame the questions in a way which we believe is within that good practice. Design out risk and insensitivity to scope, and there are now approaches that do that. I am not going to focus on them here. If anybody wants to talk about them, they can, but it makes the whole approach of talking to water customers, for example, so much easier, and indeed it applies right the way across the board. Design for simplicity and transparency, so everything, if you go with the adage of 10%, 10%, the same applies with words. The same applies that we can't use some of the words we'd love to use. If I look back at some of the surveys that we wrote or designed 15 years ago and look at some of the concepts that we try to put across to people, it's actually quite frightening. Nowadays, we're so much more aware of the fact that people don't necessarily understand the concepts that we're talking about. And another area which is being driven by regulators as well is gamification. Actually, it would have helped if I spelt it correctly. But again, just another way of trying to get people to explore things in a way that they can understand. So let me give you an example. This is in the railway industry. I talked about rewriting timetables 35, 40 years ago. This is the modern day formulation of this. I don't know how many people use the Virgin East Coast website to buy their rail tickets. Does anybody use them? If you do, you'll recognise that as being that website. But actually it's not. Actually, we've designed that website to replicate the Intercity East Coast website. And this is to do with how complex fares are, or otherwise. An issue which dominated the energy industry for quite some time when we had the 4 tariff debate. But this is a similar debate. Are there too many ticket types? Do people understand it? So rather than ask a simplistic sort of question, either through stated preference approaches or through any approach, which is, do you think it's a complex fare structure? Well, yes, I do actually. It's very complex, which doesn't really get us very far, because effectively what you're trading off is a diversity of fares with a complexity of tariff structure. We ask them just to rebook the journey that they've made. But underpinning that is a stated preference experiment with all sorts of new ticket types, new ways of looking at advanced fares, and so on and so forth. So they're just and these were all people that had recently bought their ticket on this website. So we're asking them to do exactly the same thing. It's a form of gamification, but it's a real-life situation, and we derive from that how easy or complicated people found it. Did they actually end up with a ticket which related to what they wanted? What do they do in terms of click-throughs? How did they look at the hover buttons? And all of those sorts of things. But that is exactly the information that they would have got from their normal channel of ticket purchase. But we designed it, and it has all of that complexity underneath it. And we've done the same with comparison websites in the energy industry, for example. Looking at how brand and so on fits in that. But again, it's just trying to make things so that it's a real-life transaction. I'm not going to dwell on that one. But just lastly, just to give some examples of how this kind of approach is used, it is used so fundamentally in so many of the decisions that are made. So all road investment decisions are made on the basis of values of time which are derived through this kind of approach. HS2, the same thing. Every rail franchise bid is underpinned with this kind of research. Airport investment is underpinned with this kind of research. Penalty incentive schemes that exist in a number of utility markets. D&O and water company investment strategies, tariff development, investment and pricing strategies in the communications sector and market competition. All of them are driven by the sorts of responses that people give to these kind of experimental situations. Doesn't mean to say that they've all been done well, doesn't mean to say that they can't be done better, but it is an important way of deriving information. So we should be putting our effort into making them better and complementing some of the revealed preference approaches that also exist out there. Thank you very much.